People once drew maps of land they had never set foot on. No satellites, no compasses, not even anyone who had actually crossed that ocean. Today, all it takes is unlocking your phone to see an alley on the other side of the planet. But 2,000 years ago, people measured the size of the Earth using nothing but a shadow at the bottom of a well, and they crossed entire oceans betting their lives on a single star. With no tools at all, how did they manage to fit the entire world onto a single sheet? Follow that answer step by step, and you run into a chilling truth. The last blank spot on the map was never actually land. The story starts with a piece of clay small enough to fit in your palm.
About 2,600 years ago, somewhere in Babylon, someone took a sharp tool to a wet clay tablet and carved the entire known world into it. That small tablet, now sitting behind glass in a major museum, is the oldest world map we know of. Anyone who studies it closely does a double take. The world is drawn as a flat disk, ringed completely by ocean. The Babylonians even gave that ocean a name, the Bitter River, a belt of salt water they believed wrapped around the very edge of the world. Here's where it gets genuinely eerie. Beyond that ocean, at the very edge of the tablet, jagged triangular landmasses jut outward, territory no human being had ever set foot on. And right next to them, labels reading, "Home of mythical heroes and monsters." Beside one triangle is even a note reading 7 leagues further, complete with direction and distance, as if someone had actually traveled there and left a trip log. None of it came from first-hand experience. Those were coordinates filled in with rumor and fear. So why monsters, specifically? The answer is surprisingly simple, because nobody knew any better. If you've ever played an open-world video game, you know the feeling. The areas you haven't explored are covered in black fog on the map. It's exactly like that fog. The known world got drawn in crisp detail. Everything past it got filled in with imagination. It's the same as being able to sketch your own street with your eyes closed, but just guessing at what the next neighborhood over looks like because you've never actually been there. We tend to assume humanity's first map must have been the product of careful surveying. But the truth is, that first map wasn't precise calculation at all. It was fear painted over the edges of the world people actually knew. Not long after, in the Greek port city of Miletus, a man named Anaximander rolled up his sleeves. Instead of asking the gods for answers, he became the first person to try mapping the entire world by himself. He put the Mediterranean at the center and split everything around it into 3 landmasses: Europe, Asia, and Africa. Rivers and seas served as the borders. By today's standards, it's a rough sketch at best, but it marked the first time a human being declared, "I'm going to understand the whole world for myself." He pulled a world once considered the domain of the gods down into human hands. But imagination alone couldn't launch a single ship. To actually sail to the edge of that ocean, someone first had to figure out exactly how big the world was. A man was staring quietly down into a well. The city was Syene in southern Egypt, known today as Aswan. At noon on the summer solstice, the day the sun climbs highest in the sky, sunlight shot straight down to the bottom of that well. Not a single shadow fell. For the locals, it was probably just an ordinary summer sight. But when a scholar named Eratosthenes heard about it, chills ran down his spine. He was the man in charge of the entire Library of Alexandria and the very person who coined the word geography. There was exactly one thing that struck him as strange. On that same day, at that same hour, a stick planted in the ground in his own city of Alexandria cast a slanted shadow.
Why does that southern city have no shadow at all, while mine does? Most of us would have shrugged it off as a coincidence. Eratosthenes refused to let that tiny discrepancy go. The answer turned out to be both simple and staggering. If the Earth were flat, shadows cast at the exact same moment should look identical everywhere. But one city had a shadow and the other didn't? That could only mean the ground itself wasn't flat. It was proof the Earth curved like a sphere. This was a man who'd probably never done more than climb a tall hill in his life, let alone fly in a plane, and he'd just worked out one of the biggest facts in human history from nothing but the angle of a shadow. And he didn't stop there. He measured that angle and found it equaled exactly 1/50th of a full circle, which meant multiply the distance between the two cities by 50 and you'd get the full circumference of the Earth. The figure he calculated comes within about 1% of what modern satellites measure today. How just impressive is that? It's the equivalent of someone who's never even ridden a roller coaster, let alone a plane, working out the size of the entire planet almost perfectly with nothing but paper, a stick, and 0 calculators. The exact number your phone's GPS spits out instantly, he pulled out of a single shadow puddled at the bottom of a well. We like to say ancient people drew sloppy maps because they simply didn't know any better. This man proved the exact opposite. What they lacked was tools, not intelligence. Eratosthenes took it one step further. He drew the very first grid of horizontal and vertical lines wrapped tightly around the globe, lines of latitude and longitude. It was the moment the world stopped being sketched by eye and started being placed on a proper grid. But was there anyone who took that grid, not as a rough concept, but filled it in with thousands of precise numbers? The size of the Earth was now known, but knowing the size didn't tell you exactly where any given city actually was. Trying to explain in words alone how far west and how far south you'd have to travel to reach a particular city could take all night and still fall short. Around 150 AD, in that very same city of Alexandria, a scholar named Ptolemy came up with a completely different approach. Instead of describing the world in long-winded paragraphs, he decided to pin every location down with just 2 numbers: how far north or south, how far east or west. That's the exact concept behind the coordinates that pop up on your map app the moment you open it, and Ptolemy is the one who invented it. The very words latitude and longitude were born from his work. His book, Geographia, remarkably lists nearly 8,000 locations, each pinned down with precise coordinates. He essentially gave every city a pair of numbers instead of a street address. It's the equivalent of a world with no street names or house numbers suddenly getting GPS coordinates slapped on every corner of the country overnight. There was still one genuinely thorny problem left. The Earth is round. How on earth do you cram locations sitting on a curved surface onto a single flat sheet of paper? Ever peeled an orange and tried pressing the peel flat on a table? No matter how careful you are, something always tears and something always stretches. Ptolemy tackled exactly this problem and came up with 3 separate methods for flattening a round world onto paper. None of them were perfect, but it was the first time humanity had a working rulebook for translating a sphere onto a flat page. You'd think knowledge like this would have had its moment and then faded into obscurity. Instead, Ptolemy's coordinate system remained the backbone of European maps for over 1,000 years. Even Christopher Columbus trusted this centuries-old math when he set sail westward, convinced he'd hit Asia in no time. But did this seemingly flawless coordinate map actually hold up once ships put it to the test at sea?
Surprisingly, the answer was no. A full 1,000 years after Ptolemy pinned the world down with coordinates, medieval European maps actually took a step backward. Take a look at the Hereford Mappa Mundi, made in England around 1300. It's the largest surviving medieval world map, and it places Jerusalem dead center. North isn't even at the top. Since they believed the Garden of Eden lay to the east, they put east at the top instead. And along the edges of the map, monsters are crouched exactly where they always were. And here's the genuinely eerie part. Remember that Babylonian clay tablet from the start of this video? That same ancient fear of drawing monsters at the edge of the world jumped 1,000 years and repeated itself, almost unchanged. Even as tools kept advancing, humans still reached for monsters first whenever they stood at the border of the unknown. We tend to assume a map's whole point is navigation, but at this point in history, maps weren't functional travel tools at all. They were hung on cathedral walls and read as illustrations of divine order, essentially massive works of religious art. Think of it less as a GPS and more as a stained glass window painted onto parchment. What finally turned maps from something you admired into something you actually used was the compass. 13th century Mediterranean sailors drew a compass rose on parchment, radiating direction lines outward from the center, like a spiderweb. This was called a portolan chart. Sailors traced those lines with their fingertips, plotting real routes from port to port. It's the exact same principle as your map app drawing a blue line straight to your destination today. The map was no longer something you hung quietly in a chapel. It became a tool that got salt-stained and worn smooth from being handled on deck. What had once been a map you looked at on a wall finally evolved into a map you carried out to sea. But did a map have to exist on paper at all? On the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, people had no paper and no writing system, so they wove coconut fronds and shells together to map the swells of the ocean itself. Even more remarkable, they never actually took these maps out to sea. They memorized them completely on land, then lay flat in their canoes and navigated purely by feeling the swells ripple beneath their bodies. Whether by compass or by pure bodily instinct, both cultures independently turned the map into a genuine navigation tool. But this was strictly about practical route maps linking one port to another. The big picture maps of the entire world, the Hereford Mappa Mundi type, were still frozen exactly where they'd always been. Monsters still held their ground at the edges. Nearly 150 years after the Hereford Mappa Mundi, in 1450, a monk named Fra Mauro was hard at work on a massive circular map in a monastery in Venice, Italy. This map, over 2 meters across, was packed with more than 3,000 written annotations. He pulled from an enormous range of sources to finish it. Ptolemy's Geographia, of course, but also Arabic geographical texts, the travel accounts of Marco Polo and Niccolò de Conti, and even direct interviews with Coptic Christian and Muslim merchants who had traveled from East Africa. None of this would have been possible without Venice itself being a trading hub linking the Mediterranean, Asia, and Africa. The finished map contained a genuinely startling detail. Africa was drawn as a continent completely surrounded by ocean, all the way around its southern tip, a landmass a ship could actually sail around. Here's why that's remarkable. Ptolemy's Geographia, the backbone of European maps for over 1,300 years, insisted the Indian Ocean was a closed sea, completely landlocked. This was the very same system of calculations Columbus himself trusted. Fra Mauro flatly overturned that centuries-old assumption.
What's even astonishing is the timing. It would still be nearly 40 more years before the Portuguese navigator Bartolomeu Dias actually sailed around the southern tip of Africa and confirmed it with his own eyes. Fra Mauro pieced together the continent's true shape purely from second-hand accounts, past merchant to merchant and traveler to traveler, long before anyone had actually been there. This very map changed the course of history. When Columbus approached the Portuguese royal court asking for funding, insisting that sailing west would land him in Asia, Portugal turned him down. Thanks to Fra Mauro's map, they already knew there was a real sea route around Africa. So Columbus turned around and knocked on Spain's door instead, and the rest of that story we all already know. That old habit of drawing monsters at the edge of the world got driven out one testimony at a time by a monk piecing together the eyewitness accounts of well-traveled merchants. This drive for precision wasn't unique to Europe. In fact, more than 300 years before Fra Mauro, China had already taken on the same challenge. In 1136, Chinese cartographers carved a map called the UG2 into stone, plotting rivers and coastlines with precision onto a checkerboard-style grid. The bends of the Yellow River and the Yangtze matched their actual courses almost exactly. A Western scholar would later call it the finest map in the world for its time. All across the globe, in different languages and with completely different tools, people were converging on the same goal, one step at a time. Humanity had reached the point where it could pin down exactly where any given piece of land actually was. And yet, even these remarkably precise maps still had one blank spot nobody could fill. Not Venice, not China, not anywhere in Europe had solved this final puzzle.
The nature of this puzzle turns out to be surprisingly simple. Well, only half of it, to be precise. Figuring out how far north you were was easy enough. At night, a sailor could stand on deck and look up at the North Star. All they had to do was measure how high it sat above the horizon. Higher star, further north. Lower star, lower south. The sky itself worked as a built-in ruler. The problem was the other half, east-west position. How far east or west had you actually traveled from the port you'd left? There was no star in the sky that could tell you that. It's easy to assume people back then got lost simply because they didn't know the land well enough, but the real wall they hit wasn't land at all. It was time. Here's what that means. The Earth completes exactly one rotation per day, so the further east you travel, the earlier the sun rises there, and clocks run correspondingly ahead. That's the exact same jet lag you feel flying internationally today. If you knew the precise time back home at the port you'd left and the precise time right now on your ship, the difference between the two would tell you exactly how far east or west you'd traveled. In other words, your east-west position all came down to one simple question: what time is it right now? The answer had been staring everyone in the face the whole time. The problem was, no clock in that era could keep accurate time for months on a rolling, pitching ship, so sailors bet their lives on rough estimates. They'd throw a log tied to a knotted rope overboard and count how fast the knots played out to gauge speed, then track time with an hourglass and guess their position from there. It's the equivalent of driving down a highway today with no GPS at all, just counting seconds with your eyes closed. The cost of that guesswork was brutal. It was a foggy night in 1707. A British fleet returning home victorious miscalculated its position. The sailors believed they were safely out in open water. Instead, their ships were sailing straight toward the rocks of the Isles of Scilly off the southwest coast of England. That night, more than 2,000 people drowned in the cold sea. An incredible tradition of navigation, built on reading the stars and crossing entire oceans, collapsed for the lack of one working clock. The disaster shook the entire nation.
Parliament finally stepped in. They put up a prize worth millions of dollars in today's money for anyone who could solve the problem. The era's greatest astronomers threw themselves at the stars and the moon searching for an answer.
But the person who finally cracked the problem was a self-taught country carpenter named John Harrison, who had never set foot inside a university. He'd never even formally trained as a clockmaker. He decided to look for the answer in gears, not in the stars. A clock that wouldn't lose even a few seconds, no matter how much the ship rocked, no matter how the temperature swung. While everyone else kept their eyes fixed in the sky, he spent his entire life alone, carving brass and wood. What he produced was the H4, a marine chronometer about the size of a pocket watch, something the smartwatch on your wrist does effortlessly today. Holding on to accurate time even on a rocking ship and using it to reveal exactly where you were, John Harrison was the first person to pull that off with nothing but gears and a mainspring. What he built was a clock. What he actually filled in was a map. So the last blank spot on the map was never uncharted land the way we've believed for so long. It was accurate time. From the moment a Babylonian carved a monster onto the edge of a clay tablet to the moment John Harrison locked his very last gear into place, what humanity truly had to conquer to fit the world onto a single sheet wasn't land, it was time. Go ahead and take out the phone in your pocket right now. The moment you open your map app, an alley on the opposite side of the planet unfolds instantly in front of you. Inside that small screen lives the man who measured a shadow at the bottom of a well, the sailor who bet his life on a single star, and the clockmaker who carved wood and brass to capture time itself at sea. In the end, what those people lacked was never intelligence. It was tools. And the last blank spot on the map wasn't filled with land, but with time. So the next time you get turned around on some street corner and feel a little embarrassed about it, you can stop being so hard on yourself. The map in your hand right now was built out of thousands of years of confusion, failure, and the sheer stubbornness of people who simply refuse to give up. There are still plenty of blank spots out there in the world, waiting for someone to fill them in. If you're curious about the next page in that story, hit subscribe, drop a like, and leave a comment below. This has been Olivia from Professor Room. Thanks so much for watching.